In the course of the 19th century, Shakespeare became a truly global phenomenon. I'm down in the stacks of the library of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Shakespeare's hometown of Stratford, and all around me are hundreds and hundreds of editions of his plays. We've seen how in the course of the 18th century, both scholarly editions and theatre editions became prominent. When you get to the 19th century, there's a whole diversification of the Shakespeare publishing industry. There are expensive illustrated editions, large coffee table books, tiny pocket editions, Shakespeare in every form and for every audience. His plays are simplified for children. The writers Charles and Mary Lamb produced a very influential set of tales from Shakespeare that told the stories of the plays without any of the difficult language. They were tremendously popular with children. And indeed, in the course of the 19th century, Shakespeare became a central part of the educational curriculum. We need to remember that in the great public schools for the elite class, the ruling class, Latin and Greek, the classics, was still the basis of the educational curriculum in the humanities, just as Latin had been in Shakespeare's own time. But as the 19th century unfolded and education became more and more widely available to ordinary people, to the working classes and to women, they were not expected to read the Latin classics. Instead, they read Shakespeare. He became the English classic, the centre of the English literary tradition. It was indeed in this period that the idea of a canon of English literature, with Shakespeare at the centre of it, really took form. A particularly important development occurred in the 1830s when the great essayist Thomas Macaulay, who was also a civil servant, wrote a paper for the government about the reform of the Indian educational system. This was the height of the British Empire in India. And Macaulay said that the Indian people needed to be educated in the English literary tradition. And so it was that from the 1830s onward, Shakespeare became part of the curriculum in Indian schools. That began a process that has gone on to this day, so that now over half the school children in the world at some point read a Shakespeare play. Shakespeare also became increasingly important within the examination system. I've got here the Swan edition of Shakespeare's plays from 1899, a late Victorian edition. So Macbeth is the one I've got here. It's like the scholarly editions that have gone before, in that there is a text and there are notes explaining the difficult words and phrases. But at the end of the book, after the notes, there's a set of questions, clearly specifically aimed at school children as practice for examinations. Questions on Macbeth. 1. From whence did Shakespeare derive the story of Macbeth? In what part of the story did he make an important alteration? Well, we can answer that question now. We know he got it from Holinshed's Chronicles, and among his alterations were the change in the character of the witches. There are then questions that ask students to explain the meaning of particular words and phrases. Other questions that set Shakespeare in his historical context, that interpret the characters, that place Macbeth in the course of his career. A key part of the education in Shakespeare was learning passages from the plays. Act 5, question 6, quote Macbeth's despairing description of the vanity of human life. To answer that correctly, the pupils would have had to learn tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. Shakespeare became global because, of course, the English language became global. There's a whole other course to be done on the growth of Shakespeare in America. But it was with the British Empire in India, in Africa, Australia, Canada, throughout the world in the 19th century that Shakespeare spread to every corner of the globe. And once he was in those other countries, he was performed, he was studied, he was also translated. Here in the stacks of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, I'm looking at a whole row of translations of all the plays. Here we've got Julius Caesar in Russian, King Lear in Polish. The list goes on and on and on. Shakespeare has been translated into over 100 languages. A course such as the one we're doing is available all over the world, and a really interesting project will be to look at the history of Shakespearean translation in your country. You'll find in many cases it was remarkably early in history that Shakespeare began to be translated. Down here at the foot of the stacks I've got Hamlet in just about every language under the sun. Here's an edition in Japanese, Chinese, many different Indian languages. All around the world, Shakespeare has become a global figure. There's even been a translation of Hamlet into Klingon, the fictional language of the television series Star Trek. There's a joke in Star Trek about Shakespeare always sounds better in the original Klingon, and so it is that a Klingon translation has been invented. That joke, I think, actually goes back to something that was often said by the Germans in the 19th century. We've talked about how Shakespeare was so important for the German Romantic movement and the foundation of a German national culture, how the plays of Goethe and Schiller were shaped by Shakespeare. It was also the case in the early 19th century that two great German writers, Schlegel and Tieck, translated the complete works into German. And many people in Germany said Shakespeare was indeed better in German than in English. German intellectuals in the 19th century were especially obsessed with Hamlet. There was something about Hamlet's intellectual qualities, his hesitation in the face of political need, that led German intellectuals to identify with him. One of them, Ferdinand von Freiligrath, actually said, "Deutschland ist Hamlet." Germany is Hamlet. It's an extraordinary example of the way in which Shakespeare, having become the English national poet in the 18th century, by the 19th century was truly an international poet, a voice of every culture, every nation.